childhood. One of the reasons that I wanted to become a writer is because I used to write down the things that I saw as a child. And I wanted to, and as a child, I didn't know then that I was documenting the kind of everyday violence that I saw living in public housing. So I grew up in Virginia in the United States, and it was government housing. And it was 3 generations of my family were in that public housing community. And the violence that I experienced was more in terms of poverty. And we don't always talk about poverty as being a kind of violence, but I think that was the first kind of violence that then kind of echoed into other kinds of violence, whether that be in terms of police or state violence, or even thinking about gender violence, or even sexual violence. So I started writing very young. I mean, I still have some of my writing, my poems from when I was 8 years old, and poetry became my way of expressing myself. And my brother, he still is a DJ, but he was a DJ at the time. And the one thing that I couldn't do was rap. I could rap with words, but not when the beat came. So I still, because I have my own rhythm, I'm like, leave that music alone. So I still am doing the same thing that I started doing when I was in elementary or primary school, and that is write about the everyday lives of Black people, and that's what brought me to Brazil.
Nice. So do you keep writing? Do you still write? Like
I do.
besides academic work?
I do. I have always, I started out not necessarily writing academic stories, but I started out in terms of journalism. I went to school for journalism. One of the things I said early on when I was going to college is that I wanted to right the wrongs that news media assumed of the community that I grew up in. They assumed that people who were poor, people who looked like me, were lazy, were criminals, would not amount to anything. And I knew other stories. I knew stories of love. I knew stories of resilience. I knew stories of survival. I knew stories of community. And I wanted to tell different kinds of stories. So I started out as a journalist. I moved from writing what we would call hard news or political news to more entertainment news, still trying to keep present the politics at play, even when I was talking about popular culture. And I can tell you that, you know, I write academic like journal articles and books and the like, but a large part of my work is still public work. I still do cultural criticism, where I might talk about a concert, I may talk about a movie, I might talk about a television show, and I do that whether it's in terms of a public journal or a blog. I was a blogger for a minute, for a little while, with the group Crunk Feminist Collective. So Crunk Feminist Collective was co-founded by Brittany Cooper and Susanna Morris. By the way, shout out to Brittany Cooper. Her book just made the New York Times bestseller list.
Wow.
So I was a part of the Crunk Feminist Collective, where we did blogs, again, connecting feminists, Black feminist thought within a hip hop context to everyday popular culture. So that's something that I still do today. So even though I do work that is geared to the academy, all of my work is not for the academy, because at the end of the day, I want to do work that is about the movement for Black life.
Awesome. And when did you connect these two worlds, like of hip hop and feminism? And when did you see yourself fitting that community and talking about that?
Yeah, I can say that the feminism that I know in terms of Black feminism, I did not necessarily get that from books. I didn't get it in a classroom. That in which I understood women's rights before even getting to the term feminism was always connected to white women. One of the ways in which I began to think about how do ordinary people kind of live out and engage in feminism, I actually heard from hip hop. And not just in terms of the music, but the ways in which women engage in talking about gender and sexual politics from a working class perspective. Because oftentimes I would hear discussions about feminism that was really based in middle classness. And because I came from working class, or what they would call the underclass, working class society, I wanted a feminism that would speak to working class culture. And hip hop was that space for me. It was also a space where I had to kind of carve out what we mean when we talk about hip hop feminism, because it was not just about being called a derogatory name. It was not just reactionary to misogyny, but that is absolutely important. But it was also about the ways in which young women of color, primarily Black and brown, girls and women, were trying to create a new voice and a new kind of feminism that did not necessarily have to be connected to what we would call respectability, that you didn't have to be a good girl in order to be a feminist, that you did not have to be in the academy to engage in politics. And I think with that kind of approach to hip hop feminism was one of the reasons why I still define myself in terms of hip hop feminism. And it's not just relegated to music. It's talking about a generation of people who experience, you know, particularly in the United States, globalization, increased the increase of the prison industrial complex, the dismantling of welfare, even the welfare state as we know it, the kind of growing of neoliberalism, like all of these kind of global, transnational, political, economic forces that were taking place in the 1980s worked squarely in local neighborhoods. My school district, for example, was one of the first school districts to be resegregated. So my parents' generation, they fought in civil rights to desegregate schools so that Black kids and white kids could go to school together. Well, when I was growing up, my mom still had to march, and she did march against the resegregation because you had whole communities who didn't want poor Black kids to be integrating into white schools. And this was not, you know, 1960s, 1970s. This is 1980s. So it suggests that we're having the same kinds of conversations again, and it seems to me that a new iteration of feminism is going to be born out of this moment. So I'm excited for that.
Interesting. And okay, you said that all of your history kind of got you into coming to Brazil. So what's the relationship to Brazil? Did you know anything or study anything about Brazil before you came here? And what did you learn here that changed your perspective or studies?
Well, I mean, I knew about Brazil from the book, right? Like textbook information. When we talk about, I mean, as an Africana Studies teacher, when we talk about transnational flows, when we talk about the diaspora and the transatlantic slave trade, and thinking about the different ways in which we can talk about the sacred and the secular. So in terms of its cultural, political, contributions to the African diaspora, of course, I was aware of that. What interests me is that I really wanted to have an opportunity. Much of my work is U.S. based, and I've done work in the Caribbean, mainly Trinidad, Jamaica, and even working in collaboration with other scholars, talking about Black and Brown representations, like Latinx and Black kind of icons. But I had not considered at the time that I would even do research in Brazil. I had colleagues who they were doing work, and they have noted work in terms of thinking about Afro-Brazilian identity and the ways in which we think about diaspora. So Brazil presented an opportunity for me to think about the ways in which I understand my own Blackness. So part of my research is I always want to think about these moments of being read and in some ways misread. So I like to think about those moments when, of belonging and unbelonging. And one of the things that was quite beautiful in Bahia is to have connections with other Black folk. And I needed those connections because it was a very, the group I came with, which it was a very diverse group, but it was still not, for me, centering Blackness and attempting to make the connections across the diaspora. So there was a way in which Black Brazilian experience and African American or even Black American experience was still seen as different. And each time that we had a speaker, each time that I had my own experience of discrimination within the group in which I was traveling with, it was a Black Brazilian scholar, artist, activist who actually took me in, and we exchanged ways in which, no, what you're experiencing is what we experience, and this is the context of the African diaspora. And I thought that for me, despite all of the other stuff that I experienced, within my, smaller group, was one of the most enlightening and enriching experiences that I had. And that helped to inform how, I am still kind of seeing the diaspora in this kind of elastic and fluid way, and Blackness in and of itself.
I see. Yeah, I remember when like a week after we met, that you left San Luis and went to Bahia, and I asked you how things were going. You said that the group naturally divided into colors in a way, and I interviewed Pedro last Tuesday, and he's Black, he's Brazilian, and he's been to Tampa as well. And he said that he went to a restaurant with a friend and an uncle of his friend. And this friend of his said that his uncle was racist. But he himself, Pedro, didn't see the uncle as racist, because he was just being distant and diplomatic in a way. I respect you, but away from you. So he didn't see that as racism, because here in Brazil, we kind of see racism as a direct aggression nor as a distance. So do you see any difference in the way racism is dealt with in Brazil?
No,
No.
I don't. Because when we talk about racism can be interpersonal, meaning between me and you. It can be ideological. It could be meaning the way that I think about Black people as a way that I think about non Black people. It can be institutional, meaning that Black Brazilians maybe have a higher unemployment, and that could be because they're facing systematic institutional discrimination. It can be a whole myriad of things. And when we think about racism is not just thinking about institutional. It can be institutional, it can be structural, it can be ideological, it can be interpersonal. So there are different layers in terms of thinking about racism. And if we're talking about, that example that you just gave, that could be ideological, but it could also be interpersonal ways in which we, distance ourselves. And one could do that individually, like within a group, where a group decides to do that. But in a broader group called a neighborhood, when I want to move to this neighborhood and I don't want your people near me. So we do that in our school systems, in our neighborhoods, and we might not on the face of it think that I am doing this individual act to be away, but when you choose a location, when you choose to be apart from people, where you choose to divest money into communities that need support, then you're actually engaging in racism, even as your individual act is not intentionally racist. So I would say, no, I didn't see. I didn't. What was enlightening for me, and I think not just for me, but for some of the persons who came along, was that there was a constant way in which there was feedback in terms of the historical experiences. And again, there's specific differences in terms of the different colonial histories of Brazil and the United States. However, if we're talking about, if we're thinking about racism and the Ruth Gilmore, racism equals premature death, then we can say that there are great similarities in the ways in which we see the disadvantages and the disproportionate kind of limited access, limited mobility, socially, economically, politically, that Black folk in the United States and in Brazil share. So even as in the whole kind of learning, we were supposed to think about Brazil as being outside of the context of thinking about a white-Black binary, or thinking about power as different because of the political organization. When we get right down to it, I don't care about any of those differences. If we're asking what is the life and the life chances and the quality of life of Black folk, then we're talking about not the same as everybody else, when we still see the structural, ideological, interpersonal inequities. Then we can say that no, racism looks about the same if Black people are still on the bottom.
Yeah. I was talking to Otto. He's a coffee clubber. It's what we call people in our group. And he was sharing with me his conversation with an American Black man, and they were sharing their perspectives on how Black people suffered in those two countries. And while his friend was saying that it was very harsh and he suffered a lot, he himself, Otto, was saying that it wasn't that hard in Brazil. And his friend actually told him that he was kind of mistaken and he just was kind of blind. So the way Otto realized he was behaving, or maybe the way his thought was driven by, was like a fish in the water. So it's it's so embedded into the system, and you're so accustomed to it that you don't even see it. But in Brazil, yeah, like most of the people who are killed by the police are black, and they're usually poor. So it does happen. Also want to ask you, what is wrong with the world, and where do you see where do
That's
where
a huge question.
yeah, and what do you hope it's going to become, and what are you doing to help us get there?
Okay, so those are three three big questions. Um,
Yeah.
so what is wrong with the world? I can say from my bell hooks Black feminist teaching, and I'll include Angela Davis with that imperial white supremacist capitalist hetero patriarchy in
Wow.
and not and as one interlinked system that basically is not just killing Black people, it's killing humanity and the earth. Imperial white supremacist capitalist hetero patriarchy. So that is what's wrong with the world. And if we want to dismantle, abolish, and structure a new world, then I think it's on the onus of all of us to imagine what that world could look like. And I think for what is transpiring around the globe, not just as a response to the one lynching that we were witnessing on television, but to the constant ways in which Black folk across the globe are oppressed and deprived of a good quality of life, deprived of breath, to live, to be. I think it's on the onus of all of us to try to imagine what that looks like. And for the work that I do, I teach classes in Afrofuturism. I write about Black culture. One of the first questions I ask is, you know, a part of kind of feminist cultural critique is to provide, you know, a reading, as we would say, of imperial white supremacist heteropatriarchy and capitalism. But at the same time that we're doing that deconstruction, a part of deconstruction is construction. And oftentimes I find as a teacher, I find that the most difficult and challenging aspect of critical engagement for many students. And this goes to students who consider themselves activists. I said, so after we burn this place down, what do you imagine that it will look like? And some of us have not gotten there. Like, we don't even know the kind of world that we want to create. So part of, you know, being able to imagine and to build on and to do movement work on what we want, because we know what we don't want, but we also have to know what we want. And I think this moment, we are seeing people do that kind of reimagining work. We're seeing people, when we say defund the police, it makes us think about, well, how do we engage with police? What do we mean when we say defund the police? When we're thinking about, hey, we're taking, you know, the ways in which we think about gender, relationships, sexuality, we're taking these terms for granted. What does it mean to be in an intimate relationship? What does it mean to have community? So I think in some ways what this moment is inviting us to do is to reimagine our relationships to ourselves, our relationships to community, into the broader kind of connected community. And as a teacher, as a writer, and as a Black feminist, I am really inspired by that.
I see. Can you help us paint the picture of what your students struggle to do? Like, what is the perfect scenario?
What was that? What was that? Can you
Uh,
say that again?
can you help us paint the picture? Like, what you hope we're gonna get to as a planet?
Oh, I mean, at the end of the day, I just, and again, my focus is really in thinking about Black folk, because when Black folk are free, everybody else is free. Everybody else is free. So I want Black people to live, and to live good life. And when I say good, I mean a life that they choose, a life that is filled with joy, a life that is not spent on thinking about, how to navigate a world in a space that we didn't create, that is not necessarily designed for us. So a part of that for me is helping people to imagine. So I like to think in my classes, I like to think in my work that I am providing these different ways of being. I want you to think about, how the world could be. And it may not be, this, utopia. A utopia might not exist, but I'm going to tell you that this right here, we know doesn't work. So when we think about, what does love look like? We use that language every day. What does it mean to love the earth? Right? What does it mean to be in love with community? Maybe that looks like serving, and that looks like serving in terms of if this person, again, even this work right here, I feel in some ways is in terms of that kind of service, in terms of breaking bread and having this kind of political kind of conscious raising. I feel like that is a testament and of the love that I have, and it is not in terms of a kind of romantic love, but is in terms of I can say comrade, but it's in terms of a political kind of love, in terms of solidarity. So in all of the work, and I mentioned the Crunk Feminist Collective before, I work with other groups, but I always work in community, whether it's collaboration with one person or 12 people or a larger group. I think that working together to collaborate and solve problems. And one of the problems is, we not living. And this is particularly true for Black women. Black women across this planet are leading the charge to try to create and advocate for a better world. And I think that we also have to think about wellness and health. And even when I was at the trip when I traveled to Brazil, I was not necessarily well, but I also felt like it was a duty for me to learn. And I am eternally grateful in visiting the Quilombos, and all of the other spaces to meet with activists and artists, that I got an opportunity to learn. So it wasn't anything that, in this old framework where the American is coming to look at another culture, but I in my most humble sense was rejuvenated in terms of a political spirit to make sure that I'm always thinking about political life and activism within a transnational sense, but also thinking about, even my poverty. As much as I talk about poverty in my own life, to think about the ways in which, precarity, economic precarity impacts different communities in ways that I still don't see. I am, straight presenting, cisgender. And I also think about the ways in which, even the politics that I express in solidarity could be erasing other folks. So the trip itself and, my subsequent work after the trip has made me think more intent, with more intent about what that means.
You see. So I love that you use the words like to love and solidarity and serving. Yeah, really see the world that way very soon, I hope. Trying to work towards that. And I want you like
You have to
two
have
final
hope.
questions.
I mean, you can't be a cynical activist.
What do you mean?
You can't be a cynical activist. You have to have hope. I mean, if I take this as teacher, if I walked into the classroom and I know what I know, and I walk in the classroom and none of the students know anything, and I'm like, I just give up. But what brings me to that moment, it brings me to that space every time, is that we are working together. And I have that same idea, and I'm learning from you too. So I take that in every space that I go, and that is, for me, that is an expression of solidarity. That is an expression of community. That is an expression of love. Yeah, and it's hopeful. I have to have hope, even if I sometimes think I don't. That's what gets me up in the day. That's what motivates me. If not, I mean, I guess I could do advertising, but that's not where my fire comes from.
Okay, so I've got one more question for you. Can you share your perspective on the recent events by the Black community in the US?
So, are you talking about the George Floyd lynching?
Yes.
Well, I can tell you that the George Floyd, and I use lynching very with purpose, because that is exactly, it was what we call extrajudicial killing, with a police officer who's so brazen that he, looked directly into the camera and had his hand in his pocket as he was stealing the life away from a Black man over a apparent forgery of $20. And so that video that is still in circulation and still played over and over again, that came after hearing the tapes of Breonna Taylor, who was a first responder for whom the police basically assassinated. And that comes after Ahmaud Arbery, for whom you had basically another lynching, where you had a white man shot him, another bystander with a son, and then another neighbor who was at first not seen as not a part of it, but he was actually a part of it, recording it. When I first saw that, I thought of Without Sanctuary. Around the height of lynching in the United States, lynching was such a spectacle that you would choose a big space because you wanted to bring a crowd. You would have some kind of way in which you would torture the body. And then you would take photos. So at the invention and the popularization of photography as a medium, and I'm talking because I'm a media studies scholar, at the popularity of the photograph, one of the ways in which we wanted to actually, use this idea of the photo was to take a picture of a burnt, mangled Black body, Black women, Black men, and even Black children. And then as a postcard, we mail it. White people would mail it to each other and say,
Wow.
look at what we did. And this was a way of white sociality. It was a way of bringing white people together to understand themselves as white people. So when I saw the Ahmaud Arbery, when I then saw the George Floyd on national news, I thought about the ways in which we're using the electronic medium and even social media to share in Black death all over again. So we have a new generation with a new medium, and we're still doing the ways in terms of redefining white identity through the annihilation and the systematic killing and torture of Black people. So when I saw that video, I was thinking 1920s all over again.
I see. So do you think people shouldn't share or shouldn't photograph? Or?
Well, I think the teenage Black girl who did take that video of George Floyd, who later was harassed online, I think she thought it was her civic responsibility and her civic duty. So I'm not saying, and I think if we didn't have that, we would have a completely different story. So absolutely, I mean, for many Black folk, it's like if we don't have the video, and still sometimes we see the video and there's still nothing that happens, which is the most frustrating aspect of it all. But I don't suggest that the video should not be taken, because they're bear witnessing to basically, racial terror. So I'm not saying that. I am saying that news media, in particular, mainstream news media makers, after we have seen and you've shown us the extensive footage, a part of the audience, a part of the way of re-traumatizing a whole community is by replaying and replaying and replaying and replaying, which is in some ways a reminder of the precarity of Black life. And it reminds us of racial terror. So without KKK or even racist cops going around, that one video or those two videos are ways to basically train Black folks to fear white people, and particularly white people with guns and badges. And I think that, they are unwittingly working to kind of reinforce white supremacy. So sure, we should see it, but I think news media makers should think about, the trauma that they are inflicting on communities of color by, showing the footage over and over and over and over and over again.
I understand. And what about the outbreak that happened after that? The protests and the looting. How do you see that?
Well, I'm going to say uprising and resistance. And what started in Minneapolis is now in basically, every continent besides Antarctica, every place on the globe. And again, it is because of George Floyd, but it is also because of the recognition of the recognition that we understand the precarity of Black life under an imperialist, white supremacist state and culture. And so George Floyd became the kind of impetus for uprising. But I am in full support of the movement for Black life. And as I said previously, that there's a new kind of movement. There's a new, and for me as a Black feminist, there's a new kind of feminism that's kind of being birthed at this moment. And it is one that I believe will make sure that it is transnational, intersectional, and rooted in laboring Black folk.
I see. So as a final question, what can we do not to forget this? Because we might like, oh, it happened 2 weeks ago, and they're starting to forget. It's like becoming old news. What do we do not to go back to what it was before?
By we, who do we mean by we?
The planet.
Well, because I can say for Black folk, we get a reminder all the time. So within a span of 3 weeks, like I said, we had all of those events happen back to back to back. So there's no like, oh, I forgot about this person. I forgot about racism doesn't sleep. Not at least in terms of the psyche of, not in terms of the Black psyche. So I don't know about Black people forgetting. Non-Black people might forget and move on, but it's pretty difficult to not. What George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and others do, they heighten that awareness, but it's not a forgetting.
I see. Yeah, because we see like people posting those Black squares on Instagram, and it kind of looks like they're helping, and then like it just goes away. So I just want to make sure that we are not regressing, and that all those sacrifices weren't for nothing.
Well, there are different kinds of protests. There are different ways in which people are a part of movements. There are a whole host of ways. And, you know, as much as people denounce the idea of, you know, hashtag activism, or what some call slacktivism, that it's too easy just to put the black posts up and, oh, I did this for the movement. I think that a part of what you get in a Minneapolis or in a Joburg, in Johannesburg, or in London, part of that comes from raising critical consciousness of a community. And so some of the conversations that we have online, even if they may be limited and bracketed in a moment, it is a conscious raising part. It is the seed planting, which is what I think. I consider myself in terms of the classroom. I'm like, you might not get it now, but it may come to you later. It's gonna grow. So, you know, planting those seeds. And so if you have everybody in your group, for example, posting and saying things about the movement for Black life, then that is a kind of community awareness, even if you might think that it's limited, but that might be the work that then this other activist is using when they're doing grassroots work, which is the everyday, ordinary, not the spectacular stuff, but that's the kind of work that's necessary for the everyday, so that when the revolution comes, when the moment comes when we need to be in these spaces, those people can be activated at the same time that the movement leaders are working in community. So everybody has a role. And I consider my role in the movement for Black life as a teacher, as a writer, as a critical thinker.
Okay. So I think we can end here. Do you have anything else to say? A final message?
No, I'm grateful to you. I don't think I would have been able to look up and say, "Oh, somebody take me," at the moment when I felt like I was in grave distress. So I appreciate you, and thank you for giving me the time to actually talk about Black life.
Great. You are one of the most incredible women I know, and thanks a lot for coming. And can I post this video onto YouTube?
Sure, sure, that's fine.
Great. I'll send you the link later.
All right.
Okay, so enjoy the rest of your day, and
You
thanks
too.
a lot for coming.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.